Okay, so yeah, welcome or welcome again, depending on when you joined. We're very excited to present you an intro to this series and the first webinar in a series on CCUS in Europe. So this is a series of webinars co-hosted by the UKCCS Research Centre, ZEP, the Zero Emission Platform, CO2 GeoNet, K2 in Netherlands, CCUS, the CCUS Poland Association, and IGME. So we'll start today with an overview of CCUS in Europe, and over the course of the series, we will then be hearing from what's happening in the Netherlands, the UK, Denmark, Poland, and Spain. So we have three presenters today, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function to put your questions, and you can also vote and upvote for the if you think that some of the questions are relevant to what you'd like to hear. So yeah, it's been a lot happening in CCUS in Europe in the last year or the last couple of years. We're seeing a new wave of projects coming online. So yeah, it's an exciting time for all of us. We have three speakers today. So first of all, we'll have Aymeric Amand from ZEP. Aymeric is their policy manager. Then we'll hear from Ceri Vincent. So Ceri is the president of CO2 GeoNet and is also a principal geophysicist at the British Geological Survey. And finally, we'll hear from Hanna Biro. So Hanna is the policy manager for Just Industrial Transition and CCS at Bellona Europa. So I think without further ado, we'll just get cracking. Yeah, Aymeric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mathieu. I'll share my slides right away. I've been asked to present an overview of the European CCS policy landscape, and I thought the first thing I could do was to look back at the history of CCS in Europe. Apologies for the text you'll see on the slides. Hopefully this will make it easier for you to follow. What we have here is the first big research studies for CCS in Europe date back to the 1990s. The first big projects in Europe also from the 1990s. And we had big momentum back in those days, as well as the early 2000s, culminating with big research assessments of CO2 storage capacity in Europe, such as the CO2 Stop project. And it's during that period that the Zero Emissions Platform was also created, so 20 years ago, in 2005, as part of the European Strategy Energy Technology Plan, the SET plan, which was set up by the Commission and the Member States as a first step to establish an energy technology policy for Europe, but also promote collaboration between industry, academia, and governments. So this is exactly what the Zero Emissions Platform is doing still today. And it's interesting to look back at this period because back then there were already policy initiatives to drive CCS in Europe, and some of the wording is very similar today. So I've put a communication from 2006 on the slides here, and you'll see that the wording is exactly the same today, with talking about setting up a regulatory framework for CCS, talking about expanding CO2 storage sites across Europe, and finding ways to decrease risk across the value chain. So the question is, what happened? In 2009, we had the CCS directive, which was a brilliant framework to set some safeguards for CO2 storage, and was transposed in most countries, across Europe. But shortly after, around the same time, the financial crisis slowed down those efforts across Europe and cancelled even some CCS projects. It took then a few years before CCS gained some more momentum across Europe, and we saw that 5 or 6 years ago when the London Protocol was finally amended, or partly amended, which allowed for cross-border CO2 storage and transport. but also because of the European new policies with the European Green Deal, the European climate law, setting a legally binding target to reach climate neutrality by 2050, but also with higher carbon prices in the ETS and higher projections for the ETS prices as well. This will continue to grow. We've had the carbon price reaching more than 100 euros back in 2023, and with the phase out of free allowances, we expect this carbon price to continue increasing to 130, 160 euros a ton by 2030. So it's not just signals, the policy framework has also changed. In 2021, 2022, 2023, etc. We've seen a number of initiatives across the policy spectrum, both at EU level and national level. So you see here a list of different communications and initiatives, both in the Parliament and the Commission and the Council. So we've had more support for CO2 transport and infrastructure projects, more policy frameworks and regulatory frameworks for CCS, for CCU, for support for CCS and CCU as well through state aid and funding instruments. So policy support for CCS is increasing. We have regulatory frameworks not only for CO2 storage now, but also for CCU. We had a game changer with the Net Zero Industry Act, which is I'll be talking about in a second again. More coverage as well of the value chain in the ETS and more support for these projects as well through national strategy plans like the NECPs, etc., etc. 2024, perhaps a couple of things worth noting as well. The communication on 2040 climate target, the ICMS, the guidance documents, or the upcoming certification framework for carbon removals, which has been approved, but the methodologies are still being developed at the moment. So on the next slide, you'll see that this policy momentum continues to grow with the clean industrial deal that we expect in a couple of days now, but also revised state aid framework rules, a new proposal for competitiveness fund, the actual 2040 climate target proposal, once it gets passed into law, Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act, and more in the coming years. A big one that we expected this year, but will likely be postponed to 2026, is the CO2 transport regulatory package, which I'll mention again in a second as well. So it's just to show that the last few years have really seen an increase in the number of CCS projects and policies supporting those projects. There's reasons for this as well. So if you look at the next slide, thank you. I wanted to come back to some of the key initiatives I've mentioned here, starting with the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy. So that was in 2023. And the aim of the ICMS was really to provide a sense to all the stakeholders in the value chain that the EU was finally acting upon this and expanding the sector's potential in the coming years. So we have some objectives. They're not legally binding, but we see that Europe plans or hopes to capture as much as 280 million tons by 2040 and 450 million tons by 2050, but also to store more CO2 across the EEA. And the Commission plans on developing several instruments, including the Demand Aggregation Platform and the Storage Investment Atlas. Like I said, the regulatory framework for CO2 transport is now expected in 2026 with the EU ETS revision, but that is also ongoing and already in the workings within the Commission. Another big initiative was the Net Zero Industry Act, which set for the first time a legally binding target for CO2 storage, more specifically for CO2 injection capacity, which oil and gas producers in Europe have to contribute towards too. So we need to reach 50 million tons by 2030. And the NZIA also set more provisions to have more transparency on CO2 data across the EU, as well as to facilitate permitting for key projects across Europe. And then finally, the 2040 target communication gave us some interesting numbers for CCS, including, so this is just a communications, it's not been passed into law yet, but we have some estimates as to where these contributions could come from. And we see here that the 2040 climate target impact assessment assumes that by 2030, we'll capture 50 million tons per year. By 2040, 280 million tons, and by 2050, 450 million tons. Those numbers are big, especially compared to where we are today, with only 18.6 million tons per annum that we hope to capture with the projects that are funded by the Innovation Fund. And we still lack some storage as well, but there is hope that we'll reach those numbers. As you can see on the next slides, the planned capacity across Europe is growing and growing quickly. And we have a bunch of requirements and legal provisions that make it so that member states will have to make data available and support CCS as much as possible in the coming years. Storage potential is not equal to storage capacity, of course, so that there remains some challenges, and you'll see on the next slide as well that unfortunately the geology of Europe makes it hard to store CO2 everywhere evenly across Europe. And you also see that based on the current developments and the expected outcomes of those projects, over 90% of all the storage sites seem to be located in the North Sea region, with only very few in Southern and Eastern Europe, which creates a lot of uncertainty for these countries and increasing pressure for them, as well as increasing costs should they want to transport and store the CO2. That obviously tells us one thing, is that we risk missing the target. So we're aware of those discrepancies and inequalities between those countries, and that's why cross-country collaboration is so important. On the next slide, you'll see estimates as to what the future CO2 network can be or should be according to the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, which tell us that by 2030 we need roughly 7,000 kilometers of pipelines, and by 2050 more than double that figure. We're still far from reaching those numbers, but one thing's certain is that early CCS projects that we already have in the pipelines, etc., will have a big impact on the way this network evolves in the coming years. Final point, I wanted to wrap up before my time's up, about the competitiveness of the European CCS sector. The word competitiveness is used a lot these days in the EU bubble and beyond. And even though that's not necessarily the primary purpose and objective of carbon capture and storage, which is more of a climate mitigation instrument, Europe happens to have a pretty good technological advantage compared to others around the world. We have some of the top companies and a lot of really good research capacity as well in Europe. So there is a sort of combined opportunity to not only reduce emissions in industries that will require CCS to abate their emissions, but also to boost European competitiveness in this sector and align those industrial objectives with climate objectives. So there are still a number of challenges and barriers that need to be overcome, but with a new cycle of policies, with a new commission, with a new parliament and a new governments as well, and a new interest for CCS, there are also new opportunities to unlock some of those mechanisms to drive the research, innovation, and the deployment of those projects across Europe. So I'll wrap up now and offer you a chance as well to reach out after this presentation if you wish to, and I'll happily take questions during the Q&A session. Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aymeric, for that overview of ZEP and what's happening in Europe. We're now going to move to our next presenter, so that's Ceri Vincent from CO2 GeoNet. So yeah, Ceri, floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to give a presentation on CO2 storage and transport in Europe, which has been prepared by myself and my CO2 GeoNet colleague, Paula Cantelli. So CO2 GeoNet was initiated in around 2004 as a research network of excellence. And we represent a not-for-profit research association, which currently has 26 research institutes from 19 countries, looking all focused on geological storage of CO2. What I wanted to talk about today was to think about where do we need to get to, what do we already know, and how do we bridge the gap between those two things. So as CO2 storage becomes increasingly apparent in terms of our needs in climate plans, we see that we need to scale up what we have really rapidly and really effectively. We need to learn from what all the demonstration projects and all the massive experience that we have across the world in storing CO2. We currently store something like 40 or 50 million tons every year. So it'd be really good to scale that up, and it does seem like the targets that we want to achieve are possible. So maturation of CO2 storage is on the critical path for our climate targets. We need to advance storage opportunities from opportunities to reality. We need to avoid having CO2 that we can't store or stores that don't develop because we don't have the CO2 available. So we saw, as Aymeric mentioned, we have the Net Zero Industry Act has a legally binding target of 50 million tons injection capacity per year by 2030. And modelling used by the EU's February 2024 climate communication indicates even greater targets need to be reached by 2040 and 2050. So what we really need to understand our geological storage potential is reliable data to provide assurance that will then allow us to make informed decisions on a pan-European scale. As Aymeric indicated, geographical balance of CO2 storage sites is an important element. So sometimes when we look at the opportunities for storage, it's easy to think they're focused around the North Sea, and sometimes we're looking at kind of what's ready to be developed now, but we also have to think about where we have data gaps, where we need to learn more, where we need to invest more in storage opportunities in order to develop those for future. So I think it's really important to note that on the current atlases and maps where we have gaps in storage availability, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no storage. It just means that perhaps we don't know what is available in that location. So we see that we're moving towards a pan-European network. And as we move from isolated projects to a network, it's really going to take a change in thinking and a change in how projects operate and collaborate together. And as CO2 GeoNet, we think that it's really important to have a pan-European view of what's available in terms of storage and to understand where storage could develop, CO2 storage regions that could develop. So we see a lot of emphasis around the North Sea, but we also see onshore in Central Europe, the Baltic region, the Mediterranean, all have developing potential and all have projects developing. And it's just really useful to be able to share information between those partnerships and areas. And it's really important to highlight the work left to be done. So what do we already know? So I cheated a little bit and I have included technically non-European countries. So if we include Norway as well, we currently store almost 2 million tons every year. It's worth noting that the amount of CO2 that's being stored through slate and snow is limited by the supply of CO2, not necessarily by the storage capacity. So I think that's quite important when we start thinking about the balance, the kind of chicken and egg problem that we talk about with storage. So we need to see the stores and the big projects that are going to capture CO2 developing together. And that's really quite a complex project. Quite complex because there's lots of big billion-dollar projects developing that all need to be able to talk to each other, use common languages, have common goals. So what we have already is from geocapacity, CO2 stock, we see what's called the static capacity atlas. So that's an idea of how much potential there is, but it doesn't really give us a good idea how fast we can access that potential and how well developed that potential is. So when we look at the data, as I said, I think it's really important to understand that where we see gaps, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no storage. It just perhaps means that we don't have enough data yet. We look at hydrocarbon storage opportunities. So we have depleted gas fields, depleted oil fields. We tend to have a lot of data, so we can say a lot about those areas. But we also think that aquifers could offer us a huge potential. And we need to find more data. We need to be able to explain what the opportunities are in saline aquifers too. So this is the latest hot off the press as of 15th of January 2025, and a great thanks to my colleague Paula. So here we see the latest capacity atlas. So this gives us an idea of where the storage opportunities are. It covers most of Europe. It gives some very basic data, locations, geological information about who owns the oil or gas field, who might be developing it. If there's any other projects that might want to use, for example, might be interested in gas storage or hydrogen storage or some other form of energy storage. And this is something that we see increasingly in Europe. We need to think holistically about use of the subsurface and how we use that to advance our climate goals. In the Pan-European Atlas being developed by the Geological Service for Europe project, we also see a storage readiness level, and we try to indicate with that whether how ready the storage sites are. So what do we actually know about these storage sites? So if we look at the storage readiness levels, we see most of the stores are really to quite low level, and there's just one or two in Europe that are permit ready or permitted at storage readiness level 7. So there's an awful lot more work that we can do in terms of looking at these sites, developing geological models, developing flow models, just working out how we get the CO2 to that actual store and how a project might operate, how many injection wells we need. So there's a huge amount of information and work that we can do to help advance these storage opportunities. Over the next few years, we expect to see the next tranche of CO2 storage projects starting to inject. When I was looking at this last week, I could see in the UK, we've got 1 storage permit, and then we've got 26 additional appraisal licenses. So in terms of developing storage capacity, first we have to identify the opportunity, then skipping many of the storage readiness levels, we need to have an exploration license to allow us to look at that store in detail to think and carry out activities such as seismic surveys to understand that that site is really what we think it is. And then we can obtain permission to inject and to actually store CO2. So in the UK, we have 1 storage permit. We see 26 additional appraisal licenses, expecting injection from 2028. In Denmark, we see 1 storage permit and further exploration licenses coming up too. In Norway, of course, they're already injecting. We see 1 exploitation license at Northern Lights and other storage licenses coming up. So we see this potential is developing, it's really getting there. I've been working on CO2 storage for almost 25 years now, so this for me is incredibly exciting. I've ridden the CO2 storage roller coaster, and I hope that we are going to see the final push of momentum that's going to get CO2 stored and see CCS realise its potential. So what we know so far, we know there's significant potential. We know that in the countries that we've identified, 32 of the 34 countries in the Geological Storage for Europe Atlas have identified saline aquifer or depleted fields storage opportunities. We know that many of these are lower storage readiness level and need work in order to advance them. And just to reiterate the point that an absence of identified traps or stores does not necessarily mean there's no storage capacity, since we've only used publicly available data. And very excitingly, we think that the Net Zero Industry Act will release a huge amount of data. We think that this is going to change the maps, change the atlas, give us a really invigorate an assessment of the storage potential in Europe, and hopefully give us a better view for some of those spots on the map that are still a little bit fuzzy. Because the Net Zero Industry Act requires EU member states to make publicly available data on areas where CO2 storage sites could be permitted, including geological data. And so we might see well data, seismic data, everything else that we might need to advance the storage readiness level of those sites. And they're also going to provide information on CO2 storage projects that are in progress. So we think this is going to be a fantastic resource, both for new storage operators, but also for research and innovation. And I think something else that I wanted to talk about that's a really popular topic of conversation at the moment in the CCS world is looking at how, as we move towards multi-hub development, it brings new challenges. So we have to think about how all of those different storage projects and all of the different compositions of CO could interact. We need to think about the subsurface interactions between CCS projects and other uses of the subsurface. So the amount, when we inject CO2 into the subsurface, the CO2 might be relatively small. The pressure footprint that could interact between different projects, that pressure footprint is quite large. So we need to think about how these projects interact, both at surface and in the subsurface. To realise that full value chain, we've got multiple technical projects that have to move forward together, which requires coordinated decisions and risk management across the full chain. So we've got to develop the stores, the capture, the transport, everything has to move forward together. And all of these are big projects, big complex projects. We need to think about how we can all talk to each other and developing lasting conversations and collaborations that could last for decades potentially, because that's the timescale that we're looking to store CO2 on. And we need to tackle this together as operators, regulators, researchers to find satisfactory solutions to tackle the global climate challenge. So what I wanted to say in summary, storage assessment is a journey. So storage readiness levels can help us communicate what is left to do. So we don't just, somebody asked me, when you've got capacity, do you stop? And the answer is no. So we have to look at the opportunity, the capacity, and we move it forward. It's a journey from idea to development and actual storage of CO2. So there's lots of CO2 geonets and other geoscience experts, policy experts. We see ZEP, Bellona, everybody having this conversation around CCS, working towards developing a pan-European understanding of these storage opportunities. We see exploration and storage licenses active in Europe, but we need to massively scale up. And we think we're storing less than 2 million tonnes now. Our aim is to have 50 million tonnes per year by 2030 of injection capacity. That really is quite a big scale up, and it's possible, but it requires a lot of collaboration and working together. We think that pan-European atlas is needed to highlight regions and sites for development and the remaining work left to be done. We're really looking forward to seeing the data released under the Net Zero Industry Act. We're aware that it's going to need significant resource to use that data and to collect new data to help us really understand the pan-European opportunity. And we need to look at collaboration, standardization, and planning to optimize use of the subsurface to advance CCS projects. With that, I will close. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ceri, for that very interesting overview and on storage capacity. Our next presenter is Hanna Biro. So Hanna Biro, sorry, from Bellona. So Hanna, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the national energy and climate plans of EU member states, and specifically we're assessing at Bellona Europa how, if and to what extent, carbon capture and storage is addressed in these national energy and climate plans. But first, just a few words about Bellona Europa. Who don't know us, we are a climate NGO based in Brussels. We focus on EU policy and trying to influence policy developments at the EU level, but originally Bellona comes from Norway. We have our headquarters in Oslo, and we have 2 other offices, one in Berlin and one in Vilnius. And I myself I'm a policy manager, and I focus on just industrial transition and CCS. So first and foremost, what are national energy and climate plans, and why are they important? These are strategic plans that EU member states have to submit under the governance regulation of the Energy Union, and they outline how each member state will meet the EU's climate and energy targets for specifically 2030. And they cover 5 dimensions, one of which is decarbonization. And under this dimension, in 2023, the European Commission for the first time recommended that member states reflect on the role of CCS and how that is going to contribute to them reaching their individual climate and energy goals. These plans are updated every 5 years with their final versions. For the 2021 to 2030 period. And this update, the last update was due in 2024. There's still a few countries that have not submitted their plans, but most of them already did. Now, why are these national energy climate plans important? First of all, they provide a roadmap for each member state's contribution to the EU-wide goals, and this and they help ensure coordinated approach to the energy transition across the EU, which means that the European Commission gets all these NECPs and they look at them and they see, do these individual actions, plans, will they result in the EU reaching its 2030 climate goals? Are we falling behind? Do we need to increase ambitions, or are we doing so good that we even surpass what needs to be done? Well, spoiler alert, that's not the case, but we're not falling behind by a lot. What they also do is they allow for tracking progress and holding governments accountable, which is what we do as an NGO when we analyze the NECPs. And if the NECPs are strong, they can give strong signals to the market players and attract investment through policy certainty, and they attract investments for these projects that are based in the landscape that the NECPs signal. So what we did in our NECP assessment, our methodology was based on basically the European Commission's recommendations on what should be reflected upon in the NECPs. These are 5 dimensions, and there's actually a 6th one as well, but that cannot be scored on our traffic light scoring system. So we look at these 5 ones first. The first one is an implementation plan, whether there's a concrete implementation plan. In that case, that criteria is fulfilled. If there's plans for rollout, if there are standalone projects that the government has facilitating measures for, maybe some funding, maybe some other ways of supporting the project, then we consider that criteria fulfilled. On CO2 capture, we're looking for projections or assessments on specifically process emissions. If they report on aggregate information or projections of point source emissions, but not specifically, don't highlight specifically process emissions, then we consider that criteria partially fulfilled. Of course, if they don't report it or don't mention it, then we can consider it unmet. For CO2 storage, if they report on CO2 storage capacity to be made operationally available by an annual basis, we consider it fulfilled. Otherwise, if there's plans to explore the subsurface for the purpose of CO2 storage, or if they maybe report on aggregate CO2 storage potential but not capacity, then we consider this criteria partially fulfilled. For CO2 transport, we're looking for them to report on planned CO2 transport infrastructure. Sometimes they just report on plans to explore possibilities for CO2 transport infrastructure, then we consider that partially fulfilled. And finally, the last criteria is public funding, and here we're specifically looking for national funding earmarked for CCS deployment. So not EU level funding. If they have maybe funding that CCS can be eligible for, then we consider this criteria partially fulfilled. So this is the methodology of our assessment. And what we have found is that we can group member states in kind of 3 larger categories. One of them, the front runners, the countries that are doing quite well and are addressing a lot of the criteria, the advancers that are kind of second tier, you could say, and they're addressing some of our criteria to different extents. And we're also have the third group, which is kind of falling short in addressing in their NECPs specifically some of the criteria that I mentioned during the previous slide. And we are now in the process of analyzing the final NECPs. So the differences in shades, meaning that the darker red versus the lighter red means that if the color is darker, that means we're basing this assessment on the final NECP. We have until now assessed 9 final NECPs and of course all of the draft NECPs. So yes, and we're planning to put out an assessment of one member state NECP every week. So stay tuned for more. Okay, my slides are not okay. Front runners. I hope you're seeing the correct slide. So these are the countries that are home to some of the first movers project in Europe. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Portos or Aramis projects. They largely have published carbon management strategies for developing domestic industrial carbon management value chains. They introduce schemes for financial support. Now, in some of the countries, it takes a different shape than in others. In some countries, it would be a grant, while, for example, in the Netherlands, it's a subsidy scheme. And they largely tend to have a clear vision for future CO2 transport and storage networks. And I think probably for those who are familiar with CCS or are in the CCS domain, this would not be surprising. Maybe the one country that is kind of surprising is Austria. They came out with their industrial carbon management roadmap or strategy just last year. And what is reflected in this categorization of being part of the frontrunners is how well they address the European Commission's recommendations in their NECPs, and their carbon management strategy is quite elaborate. And then the next category. Okay, would be the advancers. I hope you see the right slide. If not, please let me know. These are countries that have serious and tangible plans for CO2 value chains. They exchange with relevant stakeholders in crafting their plans. This is the case, for example, in Germany, who also came out with their ICM strategy or CM strategy last year. They are home to important projects of common interest and innovation fund projects like the Prinos CO2 storage project in Greece or the Ravenna project in Italy. However, these developments are still in their infancy. They don't necessarily meet all of the criteria, some of them to a large extent, while others partially. So these are the countries that are kind of now catching up, but especially in the case of Germany, we'll have to see how their carbon management strategy will be impacted by the recent election. And then the last category. I'm sorry, my computer is very slow. Are the countries that are a little bit falling short in meeting the criteria. They tend to not have concrete implementation plans, although there is a high bar to reach, and I would say most countries probably don't have a concrete implementation plan. They lack earmarked national level funding or some kind of support scheme that CCS deployment could tap into. They tend to not report on CO2 capture, transport, or storage needs. Although I have to say, just because a country would be in this category doesn't mean that they don't meet any of the criteria. Those countries, of course, exist, but for example, Spain does report on process emissions that would need to be abated by CO2 capture or CCS. And these are also countries that are home to some important projects of common interest and innovation hub projects. For example, the Danube CCS project in Hungary, or the Baltic CO2 Consortium project in the Baltics, and the ANRAF project, which was the first full chain CCS project in the Central and Eastern European region. So there are developments happening in these countries as well. It's the problem, or quote unquote problem, is that they're not very well addressed in the national energy and climate plans. In some cases they're mentioned, but the national governments don't seem to engage with them very deeply beyond maybe the permitting processes. And just to kind of finish off on a positive note, just because a national energy and climate plan maybe doesn't reflect the reality on the ground to the fullest, or doesn't show a lot of ambition in terms of CCS deployment, that doesn't mean that there cannot be ambition on the ground in real life. These national plans, these are not legally binding, so you can always do more. You can also always do less, but let's stay positive here. You can always show more ambition than what's in the plans. And finally, some key takeaways from overall looking at these NECPs. We think that there's a need for concrete measures at the member state level to deploy CCS. There's a lot being done at EU level in terms of the regulatory framework, of course, but in order to get things off the ground, get more projects off the ground, member states also need to do their part, and this is also in terms of national funding and support initiatives. Of course, there's the Innovation Fund, there's the Connecting Europe facility that projects can tap into, but these are very competitive. There's more projects than funding available, and it would be important to help these projects get off the ground with also national level support. And this doesn't have to be grants. They can come in different shapes. They can be subsidies, they can be tax breaks, tax cuts. Member states have a larger range of financial support measures at their disposal than the EU does. And we also recommend a bigger focus on a no regret sector, so that these are the industries and sectors that could not otherwise decarbonize, could not fully decarbonize without the help of CCS. And when directing national level support or funds, it's important to prioritize these projects, because what we noticed in the NECPs is that a lot of member states kind of seem to theoretically rely on CCS decarbonizing some fossil fuel projects or the energy systems, and that is not the best and most efficient use of the technology. There are better alternatives in decarbonizing those purposes. And finally, CCU is also reflected in a lot of the NECPs as a way to decarbonize industry, and sometimes the lack of CO2 storage site available nearby is cited as the reason for that. But we'd like to make a point that CCU without permanent storage is not equivalent to CCS. There needs to be CO2 reductions happening in order for CCU to be a climate action technology. These are just general common thread takeaways, but actually in our reports, in our analysis, we give recommendations specifically for each country based on their national energy and climate plans that you can read on our website. And like I said, we come with a new country analysis every week. And thank you so much for the attention, and I'm happy to take your questions, if any.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanna. So if I could invite all the panelists to switch their camera back on and the mic. Excellent. So we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. There's been some questions in the chat already. Just going to start, maybe if we can just structure the discussion a little bit. So I'll maybe start with a question about utilization and storage, UVS and on the policy side, and then we can talk about storage capacity. So I think there was a few questions on these two topics. So let me just go back. Yeah, so there was a question from Prashi. How CO2 use technologies can be considered as carbon emission reduction when the capture of CO2 is from a fossil-based source under the current EU policy and regulations? And we also had a question that you've answered, Aymeric, about you said that CCU permanently removing CO2 is now included in the ETS. How do they define permanent as much is going to e-fuels, which is not permanent? So maybe Aymeric, do you want to say a few words about this, and then we'll see where that takes us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mathieu. I think there's different ways to answer this question. First, if you're interested in where the CO2 is coming from and how that fits into the climate agenda in Europe, the European Climate 2040 target communication, impact assessment, etc., includes a more detailed overview of where they see these needs or these projections for CCS, and it includes very specific numbers for fossil CO2 compared to other sources of CO2. There's slightly different numbers in different papers and studies, including the European Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change. It's interesting to compare them to see where the differences lie in their estimates and projections. The other thing I would say is there's also a regulatory framework for carbon removals, which is slightly different than CCS, in that the CO2 is captured directly from the air and stored or sequestered, rather, either with technologies or natural means with different degrees of permanence, and that falls under the CRCF framework, so the certification framework for carbon removals, with different rules for BECCS and DACs, for example, but also for nature-based carbon removals. So I'm happy to take more questions, but maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. I think that you've answered those questions pretty well. Okay. Maybe questions for our geophysicist here. There's a question about earthquake risk. So, do the higher earthquake risk and general levels of geological activity in Southern Europe over Northern Europe increase the risks of very long-term leaks? So, I guess, Ceri, maybe if you could start there, and then if Aymeric and Hanna, you want to add anything, that would be great.
So this is a question we do get asked quite frequently. I'd like to kind of refer to a case study in Japan where it was very nicely described. If you think about the CO2 in the subsurface, it's trapped in the rocks, it's trapped in very tiny pore spaces in the rocks, and it doesn't really want to come back out again. So they had a pilot project. They had quite a strong earthquake, and the CO2 that was in the ground, it didn't affect it at all. Whereas the CO2 tank that was at the top of the hill ended up at the bottom of the hill on the surface. So we do take account of seismic risk. We don't see it as significantly affecting CO2 storage, but what we do think about is where geological faults might impact CO2 storage. So where we have seismicity, we often have large faults, and those might increase our risk of leakage, which is why we tend to avoid those areas when we look at CO2 storage, in case that is a conduit for CO2 to migrate towards the surface. So it's worth kind of thinking about seismic risk, as we're thinking about, could that reactivate faults? Could that increase our risk? In which case we would avoid that area for CO2 storage. I think we're very fortunate to have areas that are aseismic or very seismically quiet, where we can look at CO2 storage. So we kind of look at all of the risk factors we wouldn't store if we felt that seismic risk or other factors indicated that a storage site was not going to be secure. It takes an awful lot of effort to put the CO2 down there. We don't really want it to come back up. It is definitely one of the factors we consider in terms of risk, and we try to avoid areas where there might be large geological faults that could activate continents.
Okay, thank you, Ceri. Okay, two sort of related questions now. So one is, how do you convince governments who do not have CCS as their priority to allocate funding for CO2 storage site assessment? And how could philanthropists help deploying CCS? So anyone want to step in there? Where were you, Hanna? Why don't you give us your views?
Well, it's a difficult question. How do you convince governments to allocate money to CCS? I think if there was a straightforward answer, we would be much further in terms of deployment than where we are. But I think a lot of the kind of assumption that comes with this question is that there's a lot of funding needed to like other reduction measures, renewables. There's a lot of solutions that are sort of competing, and how can we single out CCS as one of the technologies that we know needs funding and needs a lot of upfront investment as well. And that's a difficult question. I think the way I try to approach this question and explain it is that we need funding, of course, for renewables and all the kind of low-hanging fruits, as well as for CCS, and that's because they address completely different type of emissions. At least from our NGO perspective, we support CCS first and foremost for tackling process emissions, and that cannot be tackled through renewables, through electrification. So at the end of the day, we're going to need CCS to fully decarbonize our economy, and we need to make those investments right now so we can actually rely on the technology later. So I think I hope this would be a strong case for member states to support the technology.
Okay, and does anyone want to say anything about how philanthropists could help supporting the deployment of CCS? Aymeric, okay, I'm pretty.
I'll just say this for Hanna. I think you can support a lot of research organizations, NGOs who probably don't have the means to do that research in the first place, and unless philanthropists come in and foundations. That would be my first guess. Including University of Sheffield and more. But depending on how much money you have, there's certainly a lot of projects to support in different ways, either research stage or deployment level. I think there were some questions as well in the chat at some point. Kind of lost it now, but about the role of private finance.
Yep.
So far, CCS projects have relied heavily on public funding and things like the market price of in the ETS and things like this. But we're going to require a lot more private investments in the future, and there will be new increasing roles for insurance companies, reinsurance companies as well as investment funds and etc. So yes, projects can be bankable. I think that was also a question. But there needs to be a series of different factors and parameters that need to be met. So yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Aymeric. Maybe I'll just say one more thing, and then I think we'll end the webinar since we have time. So Sylvain's kindly share a link to a CO2 storage resource catalog that is covering all of Europe already. So if you look in the chat, you can see the link there to the catalog that's been developed by the Oil and Gas Climate Institute, OGCI. I'm just going to end by saying two things. So first of all, the resources from this webinar will be available on the UKCCSRC website by the end of the week. So that's both the recording and the slides. And I'm just going to end by thanking our panelists for their contribution, the effort they put in preparing this event, and for answering the questions so well. So yeah, thank you all. This is the first in a series of webinars, so please do come along and join the follow-on, where we'll be focusing more on a sort of a national country level of CCS activities. And yeah, on this world, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.